Chapter 5, Deciding Where Loyalties Lie, 1754 to 1776. Individual Choices, James Otis Jr. James Otis Jr. was the oldest of 13 children, born on February 5th, 1725, to the lawyer James Sr. and his wife Mary Allen Otis. He grew up in West Barnstable, Massachusetts, and, like the sons of many prosperous families, attended Harvard College. He went on to become a Boston lawyer. In 1756, he willingly accepted a royal appointment as Advocate General of the region's Vice Admiralty or Maritime Court. Maritime means having to do with the ocean. Until 1761, he rigorously prosecuted New England merchants who were caught smuggling goods into the region to avoid British trade regulations and import taxes. Yet something happened that turned James Otis Jr. into a fiery critic of the British. What caused him to become a political radical and a thorn in the royal governor's side? In part, it was the government's decision to introduce general search warrants or writs of assistance that gave customs officials broad leeway to enter businesses and homes just on the suspicion of contraband or stolen goods or counterfeit goods, goods that you didn't pay taxes on. In part, it was his anger that the Massachusetts governor did not choose his father to be the colony's new Chief Justice of the Superior Court. Otis resigned as Advocate General and agreed to serve as the attorney for some merchants fighting against the writs of assistance. Although he lost the case, his argument, which is summarized at the end of this chapter in the Individual Voices feature, that the writs violated the colonists' natural rights and were thus null and void, made him an instant celebrity. Massachusetts lawyer and revolutionary John Adams would later claim that then and there, the child independence was born. For almost a decade, Otis remained a defender of colonial rights. He served in the Massachusetts Assembly, and in 1764, he published The Rights of the British Colonies Asserted and Proved, in which Otis confronted the dilemma facing the colonists. To reject any law made by Parliament was to reject the authority of Parliament entirely. Even Otis was not ready to take that radical step. In 1769, a political enemy, angered at Otis's newspaper attacks on royal office holders, confronted Otis in a local coffee shop. Words quickly turned to blows, and James Otis received a severe head injury. Perhaps he was already showing signs of failing mental health, but the blow left him struggling with bouts of insanity. On May 23, 1783, the very year the colonies officially won their independence, James Otis Jr. was killed by a bolt of lightning. John Adams summed up his friend's impact on the political life of his country. Otis was a flame of fire. James Otis's rebellion occurred within the context of the Great War for Empire between France and Britain that ended in 1763. Britain's victory in this war freed New England from the threat of bloody confrontation with the French and their Indian allies. The territory west of the Appalachians was now open to English settlers, eager for new land and new opportunities. Britain's victory seemed to promise a new era of economic growth, westward expansion, and improved cooperation between the home country and its colonies. But these hopes for harmony and goodwill were quickly dashed. Less than 2 years after the Treaty of Paris ended the 7 Years' War, colonists were protesting British policy and resisting new trade regulations, and also resisting the end of salutary neglect. In the next 13 strife-filled years, the colonists and the British government discovered that fundamental political differences existed between them. They found that they did not agree over the proper division of power between Parliament and the local elected assemblies. And they found themselves in conflict over major imperial policies. English officials, for example, thought it made good sense to curtail or to cut short westward settlement to prevent costly Indian wars. But American colonists believed that loyal citizens deserved the economic opportunity that westward settlement would provide. The British insisted that the Americans ought to help pay for the costs of maintaining the empire, but the colonists believed that this was the duty of those who remained in the home country. By the 1770s, Americans who had once toasted the king and his government now drank instead to liberty and resistance to tyrants. By 1775, a new choice faced the colonists, loyalty or rebellion. And colonists such as James Otis Jr. seemed caught in the midst of a struggle that they had never anticipated and could not avoid. The colonists who chose to protest taxation by the British government in 1765 and 1767, or to oppose the creation of juryless courts, or to complain of the presence of troops in their towns in peacetime, did not know they were laying the groundwork for a revolution. Indeed, most of them would have been shocked at the suggestion that they were no longer loyal British patriots. Yet events between 1763 and 1776 forced these colonists to choose between two versions of patriotism: loyalty to the king or loyalty to colonial independence, and between two visions of the future, as members of a great and powerful empire or as citizens of a struggling new nation. These events also forced Indians and African American slaves to choose an alliance with the king or with the rebels. The Great War for Empire and its consequences. Considering the three questions, what role did westward expansion by the colonists play in provoking the Great War for Empire, aka the 7 Years' War? Why do you think the majority of the Indian tribes cast their lot or sided with the French in this war? And for the colonists, what were the positive outcomes of British victory in the Great War for Empire? The three wars, King William's War, Queen Anne's War, and King George's War, that English colonists were swept up in between 1688 and 1740, grew out of European issues. But in 1754, the French and Indian War, aka the 7 Years' War, began, and this time the focus was on North America. Here, the tensions had been building for over a decade as the neutral zone between the French colonial empire and the British mainland colonies began to shrink. As thousands of new immigrants poured into the English colonies, the French watched with alarm as these colonists pressed further westward toward the Ohio Valley. This flow of settlers threatened French plans to unite their mainland empire of Canada and Louisiana by constructing a chain of forts, trading posts, and missions across the valley. The first confrontation came when the British sent soldiers under the command of an inexperienced Virginia militia officer named George Washington to warn the French to abandon one of their newest forts. Soon afterward, the governor of Virginia sent Washington to challenge the French at Fort Duquesne near present-day Pittsburgh. Washington wound up surrendering to the French forces. It became clear to colonists that a new war threatened. In June of 1754, representatives from 7 colonies gathered in Albany, New York, to organize a united defense against the enemy. Unfortunately, none of their colonial assemblies were willing to endorse their Albany Plan of Union, which was written by Benjamin Franklin. Instead, they all looked to Britain to defend them. But when British troops attempted to force the French out of Fort Duquesne, they too failed. Their commander, Major General Edward Braddock, died when the French ambushed his men. It was the first of many defeats for the English in America. When war was officially declared in 1756, it drew in every major European power, and it spread quickly to their empires in the Philippines, Africa, India, and the Caribbean. In America, British defeat at the hands of the French and their Indian allies seemed likely, especially when the Iroquois tribes, who usually fought with the British, chose to remain neutral until 1759. In 1756, the worried British government turned the direction of the war over to the ardent imperialist William Pitt. Pitt took drastic steps, committing the British treasury to the largest war expenditures the nation had ever known. He put together the largest military force that North America had ever seen, combining 25,000 colonial troops with 24,000 British regulars. The fortunes of war soon reversed. By the end of 1759, the upper Ohio Valley had been taken from the French. And in August of that year, a force led by British General James Wolfe captured the French fortress city of Quebec. Both Wolfe and the French commander, Louis Joseph, Marquis de Montcalm, died in the battle on Quebec's Plains of Abraham. In 1760, the city of Montreal also fell to the British. With that, the French-Canadian governor surrendered the whole of New France to his enemies, and the war in North America was over. The fighting in this most global of 18th century wars continued elsewhere until 1763. Spain entered the struggle as a French ally in 1761, but English victories in India, the Caribbean, and the Pacific squelched any hopes the French had. The Treaty of Paris established the supremacy of the British Empire. In the wider world, this name, Qianlong's empire, as the ruler of England, Scotland, Ireland, Wales, and vast holdings in North America and the Caribbean, King George III could boast in 1776 of ruling the most powerful empire in the world. Yet his was not the only impressive empire of the era. Far to the east, Emperor Qianlong of the Qing dynasty ruled over 3 million people and 13 million square kilometers, including Tibet, Taiwan, and Mongolia. Arts and literature flourished during Qianlong's reign. The French Enlightenment philosopher Voltaire was so impressed by the efficient and well-organized Chinese imperial system that he and other European thinkers advised their own kings to copy Chinese methods of, quote, enlightened despotism. The outcomes of the war. The war had redrawn the map of the world. The French Empire had shriveled, with nothing remaining of New France but two tiny islands between Nova Scotia and Newfoundland. The only other remnants of the French Empire in the Western Hemisphere were the sugar islands of Guadeloupe, Martinique, and Saint-Domingue. Across the ocean, France lost trading posts in Africa, and on the other side of the world, the French presence in India vanished. But if the French Empire had shrunk, France itself remained intact and its alliance with Spain held firm. The British Empire, on the other hand, had grown in physical size and its navy ruled the seas. But the cost of victory had been high. The British government was now deeply in debt, and it faced new problems associated with managing and protecting its greatly enlarged empire. At the peace table with France, England had the opportunity to decide what the spoils of war would be: a French Caribbean sugar island or the mainland territory of Canada. English sugar planters opposed adding a new competitor to their profitable market, and so the government opted for the vast region north and west of the 13 colonies. American colonists could not help but be pleased. With one sweep of the pen, their worst enemies had been eliminated from their borders. The treaty also held out the promise of profitable fishing off the Newfoundland coast and new farmlands in the fertile Ohio Valley. Colonists celebrated the good news with bonfires and parades, but scars remained, including memories of the British military's arrogance toward colonial soldiers and lingering resentment over the housing of British soldiers at colonial expense. The British had grounds for resentment also, particularly the profitable trade some Americans had carried on with the enemy even in the middle of the war. Suspicion and resentment, a growing sense of difference, a tug of loyalties between the local community and the larger empire, these were the unexpected outcomes of a glorious victory. Victory's new problems, considering these 4 questions. Why did Prime Minister Grenville expect the colonists to accept part of the burden of financing the British Empire in 1764? How did colonists understand their obligations to the empire? Why were the colonists alarmed by Grenville's 1765 stamp tax? And finally, how did the colonists protest Parliament's taxation policies? In the middle of the French and Indian War, King George II died in his bed. Loyal subjects mourned the old king, and in 1760, they welcomed his grandson, George III. At age 22, the new monarch was already showing the symptoms of an illness that produced delusions and severe depression. Although he was inexperienced in matters of state, George III meant to rule, even if he had to deal with politicians whom he distrusted, and engage in politics which he disliked. He chose George Grenville, a no-nonsense practical man, to assist him. Grenville's 2 most pressing post-war tasks were negotiating England's victory treaty with France and designing Britain's peacetime policies. Unfortunately, victory also brought new problems. First, to win the war, Secretary of State William Pitt had spent vast sums of money, leaving the new king with an enormous war debt. English taxpayers, who had groaned under the wartime burden, now demanded tax relief, not tax increases. Second, the new Canadian territory posed serious governance problems because the Indians were unwilling to pledge their allegiance to the English king, and the French Canadians were unwilling to abandon their traditions, their laws, or the Catholic Church. Dealing with Indian and French Canadian resistance. Both the Canadian tribes and Spain's former Indian allies along the southeastern borders of the English colonies felt threatened by Britain's victory. For decades, Indian diplomats had protected their lands by playing European rivals against one another. But with the elimination of France and the weakening of Spain in mainland America, this strategy was now impossible. Warfare, rather than diplomacy, had become their only option. When settlers from the southern colonies poured into Creek and Cherokee lands, the Cherokees mounted a full-scale, but ultimately futile, resistance along the Virginia and Carolina Western settlement line. Defeated, the Cherokee leaders were forced to sign treaties opening up their lands to both English settlement and military bases. In the Ohio Valley, Indian tribes were determined to resist not only the settlers' invasion of their homelands, but also the increase in the price of British traders set on tools, clothing, and liquor. Together, Senecas, Ojibwas, Potawatomis, Hurons, Ottawas, Delawares, Shawnees, and Mingos formed an alliance known as the Covenant Chain. Led by the Ottawa chief Pontiac, the Indians mounted their attack on British forts and colonial settlements in the spring of 1763. By fall, however, their resistance, known as Pontiac's Rebellion, had evaporated, and the Covenant Chain tribes were forced to acknowledge British control of the Ohio Valley. The British realized that their victories did not mean a permanent peace in the West. As long as the middle ground between Indian and colonial populations continued to shrink, Indians would rise up against what Creeks bluntly called, quote, people greedily grasping after the lands of red people. Settlers would then demand expensive military protection as they pushed westward. If the army did not respond, settlers were ready to take vigilante action on their own. Violence would lead to violence, unless Grenville could keep Indians and settlers at arm's length. Grenville's solution was a proclamation issued in 1763, temporarily banning all colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. Grenville's proclamation line of 1763 outraged colonists who were hoping to move west, and it also outraged wealthy land speculators hoping to reap a profit from their Western investments. Many colonists simply ignored the proclamation line. Over the next decade, areas such as Kentucky began to fill with eager homesteaders, creating a wedge that divided northern from southern Indian tribes and increasing Indian anxiety about their own futures. Because of their long tradition of anti-Catholic sentiment, American colonists also objected to Grenville's strategy of winning over Britain's new French-speaking Catholic Canadian subjects, rather than strong-arming them. To balance their loss of fishing and fur trading industries, Grenville promised the Canadians the right to preserve their religious and cultural way of life, a concession that scandalized American colonists. Demanding more from the colonists. Colonists were not the only ones growing discontented. In London, the king and many members of parliament were impatient with colonial behavior and attitudes. Hadn't the colonists benefited more than anyone from the French defeat? Asked George Grenville. And hadn't they contributed less than anyone to securing that victory? Such questions revealed the subtle but important rewriting of the motives and goals of the French and Indian War. Although Britain had waged the war to dominance in European affairs, not to benefit the colonies, Grenville now declared that the war had been fought to protect the colonists. This new interpretation fit well with the government's increasing sense that something had gone wrong in the economic relationship between England and its mainland colonies. Colonial cities such as Boston, Philadelphia, and New York had grown considerably, but their growth did not make England as rich as the mercantile theory, mercantilism, said that it should. One reason was that in every colony, locally produced goods competed with English-made goods. A more important reason, however, was widespread illegal trade with Britain's rivals. In fact, to English amazement, colonists had continued to trade with the French Caribbean islands throughout the French and Indian War. In peacetime, colonists avoided paying the required import duties on foreign goods by bribing customs officials or landing cargoes where no customs officers were stationed. Grenville discovered that by the 1760s, the Crown had collected less than £2,000 in revenue from colonial trade with other nations. But the cost of collecting these duties was over £7,000 a year. Such discoveries fueled British suspicions that the colonies were underregulated and undergoverned, not to mention ungrateful and uncooperative. When the strong doubts about colonial loyalty met the reality of British government debts and soaring expenses, something drastic could be expected to follow, and it did. In 1764, Parliament approved Grenville's dramatic reforms of colonial trade policy. Colonists greeted these new policies and the end of salutary neglect with resentment and alarm. Separately, each of Grenville's measures addressed a loophole in the proper relationship between home country and colonies subscribed by mercantilism. For example, a currency act outlawed the use of paper money as legal tender in the colonies. Grenville reasoned that this would drive colonial manufacturers, who were paid with paper money, out of business, and it would ensure that colonists bought their manufactured goods from England. Grenville's main focus was the widespread practice of colonial smuggling. Lawbreakers were so common and customs officials so easily bribed that smuggling had become an acceptable and even respectable form of commerce. To halt this illegal traffic, Grenville created the American Revenue Act. This 1764 act increased the powers of the customs officers, allowing them to use blanket warrants, called writs of assistance, to search ships and warehouses for smuggled goods. It was these writs that James Otis Jr. so eloquently opposed. Grenville also changed the regulations regarding key foreign imports, including sugar, wine, and coffee. This startling shift in policy, known popularly as the Sugar Act, revealed Grenville's practical bent. He knew that any attempt to stop the flow of French sugar into the colonies was a waste of time and resources. So he decided to make a profit for the crown from this trade. He would lower the tax on imported sugar, but he would make sure that it was collected. He would also change the way in which alleged smugglers were brought to justice. Until 1764, a colonist accused of smuggling was tried before a jury of his neighbors in a civil court. He expected and usually got a favorable verdict from his peers. Grenville now declared that anyone caught smuggling would be tried in a juryless vice admiralty court, where a conviction was far more likely. Once smuggling became too costly and too risky, Grenville reasoned, American shippers would declare their cargoes of French sugar and pay the crown for the privilege of importing them. The colonial response. Grenville's reforms were spectacularly ill-timed as far as Americans were concerned. The colonial economy was suffering from a post-war depression, brought on in part by the loss of the British Army as a steady market for American supplies, and of British soldiers as steady customers who paid in hard currency rather than paper money. In 1764, unemployment was high among urban artisans, dock workers, and sailors, and colonial merchants were caught in a credit squeeze. They were unable to pay their debts to British merchants because their colonial customers had no cash to pay for their purchases. These colonists opposed a currency act that shut off a source of money and a sugar act that established a new get tough policy on foreign trade. In the eyes of many anxious colonists, the English government was turning into a greater menace than the French army had ever been. Protests and proposals for action soon filled the pages of colonial newspapers. To many colonists, Grenville's reforms had raised profound issues about the rights of citizens and the relationship between Parliament and the colonial governments, issues that needed to be resolved. The degree to which Parliament had, or ought to have, power over colonial, economic, and political life required serious public pondering. Years later, with the benefit of hindsight, John Adams stressed the importance of the Sugar Act in starting America down the road to independence. "I know not why we should blush to confess," wrote Adams, "that molasses, liquid sugar, was an essential ingredient in American independence." But in 1764, colonists were far from agreement over the issue of parliamentary and local political powers. They were not even certain how to respond to the Sugar Act. The Stamp Act. Did Grenville stop to consider the possibility of grave problems arising from his post-war policies? Probably not. He was hardly a stranger to protest and anger, for he had often heard British citizens grumble about taxes and assert their rights against the government. As he saw it, his duty was to fill the treasury, reduce the nation's staggering debt, arm its troops, and keep the Royal Navy afloat. The duty of loyal British citizens, he believed, was to obey the laws of their sovereign government. Grenville had no doubt that the measures he and Parliament were taking to regulate the colonies and the revenue-producing trade were constitutional. Some colonists, however, had doubts. To settle the issue, Grenville proposed another piece of legislation designed not only to raise revenue, but to assert the principle of parliamentary sovereignty. The new law was called the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act of 1765, this is very important, folks, was going to be the first direct tax ever laid on the colonies by Parliament. A direct tax is defined as a tax imposed to raise revenue rather than to regulate trade. There was nothing startling or novel about this revenue collecting method. A stamp tax raised money by requiring the use of government stamped paper on certain goods or as part of the cost for certain services. It was simple and efficient, and several colonial legislatures used this method themselves. What was startling, however, was that this tax had nothing to do with foreign trade. Until 1765, Parliament had passed many acts regulating colonial trade, and if these regulations generated revenue for the crown, the colonists didn't complain. They accepted this as a form of external taxation. But colonists were convinced that only their local assemblies had the power to impose direct taxes like the stamp tax. Grenville's Stamp Act was a sharp break from the traditional understanding of the relationship between Britain and the colonies, and it challenged the distribution of political power between colonial assemblies and Parliament. Most members of Parliament, however, saw the Stamp Act as an efficient and modest redistribution of the burden of the empire, and a constitutional one. Colonists were certainly not being asked to shoulder the entire burden, since the estimated £160,000 in revenue from the stamped paper would cover only 1/5 of the cost of maintaining a British army in North America. The new law, passed in February 1765, was set to go into effect in November of that year. The 9-month delay gave Grenville time to print the stamped paper and to ship it across the Atlantic, and to appoint agents to receive and distribute the stamps in each colony. News of the tax, however, crossed the ocean rapidly and was greeted with outrage. Virtually every free man and woman was affected by a tax that required stamps on all legal documents, newspapers and pamphlets, even playing cards and dice. Grenville was reaching into the pockets of the rich, who would need stamped paper to draw up wills and property deeds and to bring suit in court. And he was emptying the pockets of the poor, who would feel the pinch when dealing a hand of cards in a tavern or buying a printed broadside filled with advertising. Colonial merchants and ship captains would have to use stamped clearances for all shipments or risk the seizure of their cargoes by the Royal Navy. Lawyers feared the loss of clients if they had to add the cost of stamps to their fees. Thus, with the stamp tax, Grenville united northern merchants, southern planters, rural women, and urban working men, and he riled the most articulate and argumentative of all Americans, lawyers and newspaper publishers. Basically, he's making everybody mad, and they're all united in their anger about this. The popular response. Many colonists proved ready to resist the new legislation. Massachusetts, whose smugglers were already choking on the new customs regulations and whose assembly had a long history of struggle with local crown officers, led the way. During the summer of 1765, a group of Bostonians formed a secret resistance organization called the Sons of Liberty. The Sons were led by the irrepressible Samuel Adams. He was a Harvard-educated member of a prominent Massachusetts family who preferred the company of local working men and women to the comfortable parlors of his relatives. Adams was a quick-witted, dynamic champion of working-class causes. He had a genius for writing propaganda and for mobilizing popular sentiment on political and community issues. Many members of the Sons of Liberty were artisans and shopkeepers, but the group's main support came from men of the city's laboring classes who had been hard hit by the post-war depression and would suffer from the stamp tax. These colonists had little influence in the legislature or with crown officials, but they compensated by staging public demonstrations and protests. By January 1765, New York City also had a Sons of Liberty organization, and by August, the Sons could be found in other cities and towns across the colonies. Boston led the way in the demonstrations and protests that soon erupted. On August 14th, shoemaker Ebenezer McIntosh led a crowd to protest the appointment of the colony's stamp agent, the wealthy merchant Andrew Oliver. The crowd, which included a number of the city's gentlemen disguised as working men, paraded through the city streets carrying an effigy of Oliver. They then destroyed Oliver's dockside warehouse and went on to break all the windows in his home. The message was clear, and Oliver understood it well. The following day, Andrew Oliver resigned as stamp agent. Boston Sons of Liberty celebrated by declaring the tree on which they hanged Oliver's effigy the Liberty Tree. But Oliver's resignation did not end the protest. Customs officers and other crown officials living in Boston were threatened with words and worse. The chief target of abuse, however, was the wealthy merchant and political officeholder Thomas Hutchinson. Hutchinson was resented by many of the ambitious younger political leaders because he monopolized appointive offices in the colony's government, and he was hated by the working men because of his disdain for ordinary people. Late one August evening, a large crowd surrounded Hutchinson's elegant brick mansion. Hutchinson and his family, warned of trouble, had wisely fled, escaping just before rocks began to shatter the parlor windows. By dawn, the house was in ruins, and Hutchinson's furniture, clothing, and personal library had been trashed. The attack on Hutchinson revealed that sometimes protests were not simply over British policies, but also over local issues and against local elites as well. It was not surprising, therefore, that prosperous merchants and shippers soon saw a potential danger in the mobilization of lower-class crowds like the Sons of Liberty. For elites like Hutchinson, crowd protest was a double-edged sword, a useful weapon that could be deadly in the wrong hands. The campaign against the stamp agents spread like a brush fire across the colonies. Agents in Connecticut, Rhode Island, Maryland, and New York were mercilessly harassed. Most stamp agents resigned. When the stamps reached colonial ports in November, only the young and conservative colony of Georgia could produce anyone willing to distribute them. Colonial governors retaliated by refusing to allow any colonial ships to leave port, hoping to persuade local merchants to help end the resistance. Their strategy backfired. Violence increased as hundreds of unemployed sailors took to the streets, terrorizing customs officers and any colonists suspected of supporting the king's taxation policy. Political debate. While the Sons of Liberty and their supporters demonstrated in the streets, colonial political leaders were proceeding with caution. Virginia lawyer and planter Patrick Henry briefly stirred passions in the House of Burgesses when he suggested that the Stamp Act was evidence of the king's tyranny. Not everyone agreed with him that the measure was so serious. Many did agree with James Otis, however, that the heart of the matter was not stamped paper, but parliamentary sovereignty versus the rights of colonial citizens. No taxation without representation. The principle that citizens cannot be taxed by a government unless they are represented in it was a fundamental assumption of free white Englishmen on both sides of the Atlantic. The crucial question was this: did the House of Commons represent the colonists, even though no colonist sat in the House and none voted for its members? If the answer was no, then the Stamp Act violated the colonists' most basic rights of Englishmen. Stating the issue in this way led to other concerns. Could colonial political leaders oppose a single law such as the Stamp Act without completely denying the authority of the government responsible for its passage? This was the question that troubled James Otis Jr. He, for one, was not prepared to become a rebel. Instead, he proposed that Parliament give seats in the government to colonial representatives. Like Otis, most political leaders shrank from denying Parliament's authority. But his suggestion that Parliament admit colonial representatives satisfied no one. A small contingent of colonial members of Parliament would have little power and was likely to find its views ignored. The only solution seemed to be to protest against the Stamp Act, to demand its repeal, and to warn Parliament that Americans would resist further efforts to infringe on their rights and liberties. Many members of the colonial legislatures felt more was needed than strong words and implicit threats. Their own authority was at stake, for if Parliament asserted its right to govern the colonies directly, their powers would be diminished. These men had much to lose: status, prestige, and the many benefits that came from deciding how tax monies would be allocated. Thus, when Massachusetts suggested an intercolonial meeting of delegates be held to discuss the Stamp Act crisis, the idea was greeted with enthusiasm by other colonial legislatures. Grenville's policies appeared to be bringing about what had once seemed impossible: united political action by the colonies. Yet in the fall of 1765, delegates from 9 colonies met in New York to consider a general and unified, dutiful, loyal, and humble representation to the King and Parliament. The petitions this historic Stamp Act Congress ultimately produced were far bolder than the delegates first intended. While conceding parliamentary authority over the colonies, they denied Parliament's right to impose any direct taxes on them. No taxes, the Congress said, ever have been or can be constitutionally imposed on the colonies but by their respective legislatures. Clearly, Americans expected this tradition to be honored. Repeal of the Stamp Act. Neither the protest in the streets nor the arguments of the Stamp Act Congress moved the king or parliament to repeal the stamp tax. But the most powerful weapon in the colonial arsenal was a refusal to purchase English goods, for English manufacturers relied heavily on their colonial markets. On the night before the stamp tax officially went into effect, 200 New York merchants announced that they would not import any new British goods. Local artisans and laborers rallied to support this boycott. The movement for a boycott, which colonists called non-importation and non-consumption, spread quickly. By the end of November, several colonial assemblies had publicly endorsed the boycott agreement signed by local merchants. Popular support widened as well. English exporters complained bitterly of the damage done to their business and pressured Parliament to take colonial protests seriously. Meanwhile, colonists were simply ignoring the hated law anyway, continuing to sue their neighbors, sell their land, publish their newspapers, and buy their playing cards as if the stamped paper and the Stamp Act didn't exist. They're ignoring it. For unrelated reasons, by winter's end, Grenville had been replaced by Lord Rockingham, and for the new prime minister, the critical issue is how to repeal the Stamp Act without appearing to cave into colonial pressure. In 1766, the government came up with a satisfactory solution. Great Britain repealed the Stamp Act, but at the same time passed a Declaratory Act. The Declaratory Act asserted that the colonies were, quote, subordinate unto and dependent upon the imperial crown and Parliament of Great Britain. Thus, this act reaffirmed an absolute Parliament's right to pass legislation for and raise taxes from the North American colonies. It's an act to try to save face. Colonists celebrated the repeal with public outpourings of loyalty to England that were as impressive as their public protests had been. There were cannon salutes, bonfires, parades, speeches, grand gestures of loyalty, and public toasts to the king and Rockingham. In one spectacular but poorly executed gesture, the Liberty Boys of Plymouth, Massachusetts, tried to move Plymouth Rock to the center of town. When the famous rock on which the Pilgrims were said to have landed split in two, half of it was carried to Liberty Pole Square, where it remained until 1834. As for the Declaratory Act, colonists who commented on it at all dismissed it as a face-saving device. To a degree, they were correct. But the Declaratory Act expressed the views of powerful men in Parliament, and within a year, they put it to the test. Asserting American rights. Considering the two questions, why did Charles Townshend expect his revenue-raising measures to be successful? And what forms of resistance did the colonists use against Townshend's measures, and what were the results? By the summer of 1766, William Pitt, who had resigned from George III's government, had returned to power. But Pitt was old and he was preoccupied with his failing health. A young playboy named Charles Townshend, serving as Chancellor of the Exchequer, rushed in to fill the leadership void. This brash young politician wasted little time foisting a new package of taxes on the colonies. The Townshend Acts and colonial protests. During the Stamp Act crisis, Benjamin Franklin had assured Parliament that American colonists accepted indirect taxation through trade regulations, even if they violently protested a direct tax such as the Stamp Act. In 1767, Townshend decided to test this distinction by proposing new regulations on a variety of imported necessities and luxuries. But unlike any import taxes the colonies had ever seen, the Townshend Acts taxed products made within the British Empire. The Townshend Acts taxed glass, paper, paint, and lead products, all made in England. The Acts also placed a 3-penny tax on tea, considered a necessity by virtually all colonists. Townshend wanted to be certain these taxes were collected, so he ordered new customs boards in the colonies and created new vice admiralty courts in the major port cities of Boston, Charleston, and Philadelphia to try cases of smuggling or tax evasion. In case Americans tried to harass customs officials, Townshend ordered British troops transferred from the western regions to the major colonial port cities. To help finance this military occupation of key cities, Townshend invoked the 1766 Quartering Act, a hated law requiring colonists to provide room and board to troops stationed in their midst, including candles, firing, bedding, cooking utensils, salt and vinegar, and a ration of beer, cider, or rum. Clearly taking every precaution to avoid the embarrassment Grenville had suffered in the Stamp Act disaster, Townshend relied on the presence of uniformed soldiers, known as redcoats because of their scarlet jackets, to keep the peace. When news of the new regulations reached the colonies, however, the response was immediate, determined, and well-organized resistance. Newspaper accounts indicate that the colonists were united in their opposition to the Townshend Acts and the repressive enforcement policies. In Boston, Samuel Adams voiced his outrage. Is it possible to form an idea of slavery more complete, more miserable, more disgraceful? There's a picture of Sam Adams present on this page as well, and to read that caption, Samuel Adams, whose family owned a Boston brewery, was the undisputed leader of the popular protest movement in Massachusetts during the 1760s and 1770s. Adams was one of the organizers of the Sons of Liberty, a group responsible for many of the demonstrations against British policies, as well as some of the violence against British officials. After the Revolution, he served as governor of Massachusetts. Others worried more about the economic burden of new taxes and quartering troops than about political rights. Boston lawyer Josiah Quincy Jr. asked readers of the Boston Gazette, "Is not the bread taken out of the children's mouths and given unto the dogs?" John Dickinson, a well-respected Pennsylvania landowner and lawyer, laid out the basic American position on imperial relations in his pamphlet Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, 1767. Direct taxation without representation violated the colonists' rights as English citizens, Dickinson declared. But by imposing any tax that did not regulate foreign trade, Parliament also violated those rights. Dickinson also considered and rejected the British claim that Americans were represented in the House of Commons. According to the British argument, colonists enjoyed, quote, virtual representation because the House of Commons represented the interests of all citizens in the empire who were not members of the nobility, whether those citizens participated directly in elections to the House or not. Like most Americans, Dickinson discounted virtual representation. What Englishmen were entitled to, he wrote, was actual representation by men they had elected to government to protect their interests. For qualified voters in the colonies who enjoyed actual representation in their local assemblies, virtual representation was nothing more than a weak excuse for exclusion and exploitation. As one American quipped, "Our privileges are all virtual, our sufferings are real." There's an excerpt on this page, Toward a More Perfect Union, Direct Representation versus Virtual Representation. In 1689, the English Bill of Rights forbade any taxes imposed without the consent of Parliament. The goal of this Bill of Rights was to limit the power of the monarch. As one of the political writers who supported the Glorious Revolution put it, when an English king has no right to demand, and an English subject has a right to refuse. But in the 17th and 18th centuries, did Parliament represent all English citizens, even those who lived across the ocean in the colonies? Most English political leaders said yes. Taxation was initiated in the House of Commons, and by virtue of the fact that the House represented all commoners, the colonists too were represented. American political leaders in the 1760s and 1770s rejected this notion of virtual representation. They demanded actual representation, the right to elect the people who served in office and tax them. Thus, no taxation without representation became a rallying cry of the American Revolution. Yet the framers of the US Constitution incorporated the notion of indirect election in 1787 in two ways. The Constitution explicitly stated that the Senate was to be chosen by state legislatures, and this did not change until 1913, when the 17th Amendment was ratified. And implicitly, during the 19th century, wives were said to be represented by virtue of the fact that their husbands could vote. This did not change until 1920 with the ratification of the 19th Amendment. Popular resistance began when Samuel Adams set in motion a massive boycott of British goods to begin on January 1st, 1768. Simple economics contributed forcefully to support for the boycott. Boston artisans remained enthusiastic about any action that stopped the flow of inexpensive English-made goods to America, because it would make it easier to sell their own goods. Small-scale merchants who had little access to British goods were also eager to see non-importation enforced. The large-scale merchants who had led the 1765 boycott were not enthusiastic, however. By 1767, their warehouses were no longer overflowing with English stock unsold during the post-war depression, and the boycott might cut off their livelihoods. Many of these elite merchants delayed signing the agreements. Others didn't sign at all. Those who opposed resistance to the Townshend Acts most strongly were colonists holding Crown-appointed government offices. These fortunate few, including judges and customs men, had sworn to uphold the policies of the British government. They were inclined to see British policymakers as well-intentioned, and they saw acceptance of British policy as a patriotic duty. Jonathan Sewall, the King's Attorney General in Massachusetts, was perhaps typical of these royal office holders. Sewall's family went back generations, and he had deep roots in his colonial community. His closest friend was John Adams, cousin of Samuel Adams, and the wealthy Boston merchant and smuggler John Hancock would soon become his brother-in-law. Yet Sewall became a staunch public defender of Crown policy. In his newspaper articles, he urged his neighbors to ignore the call to resistance, and he questioned the motives of the leading activists, suggesting that greed, thwarted ambition, and envy, rather than high-minded principles, motivated the rabble-rousers. But despite their prestige and their positions of authority, Crown officers like Sewall were unable to prevent the boycott or to slow the spread of resistance. The 1768 boycott brought politics into the lives of women just as the Stamp Act mobilized working-class men. Women's boycott of English cloth was critically important, and many women rose to the challenge, resurrecting the tedious skill of spinning yarn for cloth. Taking a bold political stance, women, including wealthy mothers and daughters, formed groups called the Daughters of Liberty, and they staged large public spinning bees to show support for the boycott. Wearing clothing made out of homespun became a mark of honor and a political statement. As one male observer noted, the ladies may vie with the men in contributing to the preservation and prosperity of their country and equally share in the honor of it. Through the boycott, politics had entered the domestic circle. The British humiliated. Although the Townshend Acts met with defiance in almost every colony, Massachusetts provided the greatest embarrassment for Parliament and the King. The Assembly defied the colonial governor, Francis Bernard, by issuing a circular letter to other colonies calling for united protest against the Townshend Acts. The helpless governor could do nothing to save face except dismiss the Assembly, leaving the colony without any representative government. Bernard's ability to ensure law and order then eroded rapidly. Throughout 1768, enforcers of the boycott roamed the streets of Boston, intimidating pro-British merchants and harassing anyone wearing British-made clothing. Boston mobs of men and women openly threatened customs officials, and the Sons of Liberty protected the colony's thriving business in smuggling foreign goods and the items listed in the hated Townshend Acts. The flamboyant John Hancock, one of the town's most notorious smugglers, grew more popular with his neighbors each time he unloaded his illegal cargoes of French and Spanish wines or West Indian sugar. When customs officers seized Hancock's vessel, aptly named the Liberty, in June of 1768, protesters beat up senior customs men, and mobs visited the homes of other royal officials. The now desperate Governor Bernard sent an urgent plea for help to the British government. In October of 1768, 4,000 troops arrived in Boston, 1 soldier for every 4 citizens. John Adams marveled at what he considered British thick-headedness. The presence of so many young soldiers, far from home and surrounded by a hostile community, was certain to worsen the situation. Military occupation of Boston, Adams warned, made more violence inevitable. Adams was right. With time on their hands, the soldiers passed the hours courting any local women who would speak to them and pestering those who would not. They angered local dock workers by moonlighting in the shipyards when off duty and taking jobs away from colonists by accepting lower pay. For their part, Civilians taunted the sentries, insulted the soldiers, and refused the military any sign of hospitality. News of street corner fights and tavern brawls inflamed feelings on both sides. Samuel Adams and his friends did their best to fan the flames of hatred, publishing daily accounts of both real and imaginary confrontations in which soldiers threatened the honor or endangered the safety of innocent townspeople. The military occupation dragged on through 1769 and early 1770. On March 5th, the major confrontation most people expected occurred. An angry crowd began throwing snowballs, undoubtedly laced with bricks and rocks, at British sentries guarding the customs house within Boston. The Redcoats, who were under strict orders not to fire on civilians, issued a frantic call for help in withdrawing to safety. When Captain Thomas Preston and his men arrived to rescue the sentries, the growing crowd immediately enveloped them. How and under whose orders Preston's soldiers began to fire is unknown, but they killed 5 men and wounded 8 other colonists. 4 of the 5 victims were white laborers. The 5th, Crispus Attucks, was a free black sailor. Paul Revere's engraving of this, the Boston Massacre, appeared in newspapers the day after the confrontation between Redcoats and Boston citizens. Even though Captain Preston and most of his soldiers were to be found innocent of wrongdoing, which I'll read out loud here in a minute, this is an excerpt underneath the photo, Revere's striking image of innocent civilians and murderous soldiers remained fixed in the popular imagination. It reinforced suspicion that the British were plotting to deprive Americans of their rights and liberties. Massachusetts protest leaders immediately labeled the confrontation the Boston Massacre. Their account appeared in colonial newspapers everywhere and included a dramatic anti-British illustration engraved by silversmith Paul Revere that I just read the caption for. A jury of colonists later cleared Preston and all but 2 of his men of the charges against them. They were represented by none other than future President John Adams, the British were. But nothing that was said at their trial, no sworn testimony, no lawyers' arguments, could erase the image of British brutality against British subjects. Even before the bloodshed of March 5th, Edmund Burke, a member of Parliament known for his sympathy to the colonial cause, had warned the House of Commons that the relationship between Britain and the colonies was both desperate and tragic. The Americans, Burke said, have made a discovery, or think they have made one, that we mean to oppress them. We have made a discovery, or think we have made one, that they intend to rise in rebellion. We do not know how to advance, they do not know how to retreat. Parliament was ready to act to ease the crisis and make a truce possible. A new minister, Frederick Lord North, was given the reins of government, and on the very day Captain Preston's men fired on the crowd at Boston, Lord North repealed the Townshend Acts and allowed the hated Quartering Act to expire. The Boston Massacre did not cause that repeal, they simply happened on the same day. Yet Lord North wanted to give no ground on the question of parliamentary control of the colonies. For this reason, he kept the tax on tea to preserve a principle rather than to fill the king's treasury. Success weakens colonial unity. Repeal of the Townshend Acts allowed the colonists to return to the ordinary routine of their lives, but it was not true that all tensions had vanished. Troubling ones remained, and they were largely among the colonists themselves. Struggling artisans and laborers now found themselves at odds with their former allies, the merchants. In fact, many elite colonists gladly abandoned the radical activism they had shown in the 1760s in favor of social conservatism. Their fear of British tyranny dimmed, but their fear of the lower classes' clamor for political power grew. Many of the poorer people, observed one supporter of expanded political participation, deeply felt that the aristocratic power, or rather the intolerable tyranny of the great and opulent. The new political language in which common men justified their demands made their social superiors uneasy. Their own impassioned appeals for rights and liberties were returning to haunt some of the colonial elite. The crisis renewed, considering the questions: what British policies led Americans to imagine a plot against their rights and liberties? And how did the king hope to crush resistance in Massachusetts? And how did the Continental Congress respond? Lord North's government took care not to disturb the calm created by the repeal of the Townshend Acts. Between 1770 and 1773, North proposed no new taxes on the colonists and made no major changes in colonial policy. American political leaders took equal care not to make any open challenges to British authority. Both sides recognized that their political truce had its limits. It did not extend to smugglers and customs men who continued to lock horns. It did not end the bitterness of Southern colonists who wished to settle beyond the proclamation line. It did not erase the distrust colonial political leaders and the British government felt for each other. Disturbing the peace of the early 1770s. The British effort to crack down on American smuggling continued to disturb New England merchants whose fortunes were built on trade with the Caribbean. They resented the sight of customs officers at the docks and of customs ships patrolling the coastline. Rhode Island merchants took revenge against the determined and highly effective customs operations in their colony. One June day in 1772, the customs patrol boat Gaspee ran aground as it chased an American vessel off Rhode Island. That evening, a band of colonists boarded the Gaspee, taunted the stranded customs men, and then set fire to their boat. Rhode Islanders called the burning of the Gaspee an act of political resistance. The English called it an act of vandalism, and they appointed a royal commission to investigate. To their amazement, no witnesses came forward, and no evidence could be gathered to support any arrests. Many American political leaders were convinced that the British government had intended to bring its subjects to England for trial and thus deprive them of a jury of their peers. They read this as further evidence of the plot to destroy American liberty, and they decided to keep in close contact to monitor British moves. Following the Virginia Assembly's lead, 5 colonies organized a communications network called the Committees of Correspondence, instructing each committee to circulate detailed accounts of any questionable royal activities in its colony. These committees of correspondence were also a good mechanism for coordinating protest or resistance should the need arise. Thus, the colonists put in place their first permanent machinery of protest. The Tea Act and the Tea Party. During the early 1770s, colonial activists worked to keep the political consciousness of the 1760s alive. Without major British provocation, however, a revival of mass action was unlikely. In 1773, Parliament provided just that provocation. This time, the government was not setting new colonial policy, but trying to save a major commercial enterprise, the East India Tea Company. Mismanagement, coupled with the American boycott and the tendency of colonists to buy smuggled Dutch tea, had left the company in serious financial trouble, its warehouses bursting with unsold tea. The company directors had a plan. If Parliament allowed them to ship their tea directly to the colonial market, eliminating the English merchants who served as middlemen, they could lower their prices and compete effectively against the smuggled Dutch tea. Even with the 3-penny tax on tea that remained from the Townshend era, smart consumers would see this as a bargain. Lord North liked the plan and saw in it an opportunity for vindication. Americans who purchased the cheaper English tea would be confirming Parliament's right to tax the colonies. With little debate, Parliament made the company's arrangement legal through passage of the Tea Act of 1773. No one expected the colonists to object. Once again, British politicians had seriously misjudged the impact of their decisions. Colonists read the Tea Act as an insult, a challenge, another chilling sign of conspiracy against their liberty. They distrusted the arrangement, believing that the East India Tea Company would raise its prices dramatically once all foreign teas were driven off the market. And they were concerned that if other British companies marketing products in the colonies followed the East India Tea Company's example, prices for scores of products would soar. These objections, however, paled beside the colonists' immediate grasp of Lord North's strategy. Purchasing cheaper English tea would confirm Parliament's right to tax the colonies. The tea that Americans drank might be cheap, but the price of conceding the legitimacy of the tea tax was too high. Colonists mobilized their resistance in 1773 with the skill acquired from a decade of experience. In several cities, crowds met the ships carrying the East India tea and prevented the unloading of their cargoes. They used the threat of violence to persuade ship captains to return to England with the tea still on board. As long as both the captains and the local royal officials gave in to these pressures, no serious confrontation occurred. But in Massachusetts, the most famous victim of mob violence, now Governor Thomas Hutchinson, was not willing to give in. A stalemate resulted. Colonists refused to allow crews to unload the tea, but Hutchinson refused to allow the tea ships to depart without unloading their tea. Boston activists broke the stalemate on December 16, 1773, when some 60 men, thinly disguised as Mohawk Indians, boarded the tea ships. Working calmly and methodically, they dumped 342 chests of tea, worth almost 10,000 pounds, into the waters of Boston Harbor. The Intolerable Acts, aka the Coercive Acts. The Boston Tea Party delighted colonists everywhere. The Crown, however, failed to see the humor in this deliberate destruction of valuable private property. The tea chests had barely settled into the harbor mud before Parliament retaliated. The king and his minister meant to make an example of everyone in Boston, the source of so much trouble and embarrassment over the past decade. Americans on the scene in England warned friends and family back home of the growing rage against the colonies. Arthur Lee, serving in London as Massachusetts' colonial agent, drew a gloomy picture in a letter to his brother. "The storm you see runs high," he wrote, "and it will require great prudence, wisdom, and resolution to save our liberties from shipwreck." The 4 acts, known as the Coercive Acts, that Parliament passed in 1774 to discipline Massachusetts, were as harsh and uncompromising as Arthur Lee predicted. The colonists called them the Intolerable Acts. The Port Act closed the port of Boston to all trade until the citizens compensated the East India Tea Company fully for its losses. This was a devastating blow to the colony's economy, since they had to pay all that money back. The Massachusetts Government Act transferred much of the power of the colony's assembly to the royal governor, including the right to appoint judges, sheriffs, and members of the colonial legislature's upper house. The colony's town meetings, which had served as forums for anti-British sentiment and protests, also came under the governor's direct control. A third measure, the Justice Act, allowed royal officials charged with capital crimes to stand trial in London rather than before local juries who might not like them so much. And a new quartering act gave military commanders the authority to house troops in private homes. To see that these laws were all enforced, the king named General Thomas Gage, commander of the British troops in North America, as the acting governor of Massachusetts. At the same time that Parliament passed these punitive measures, the British government issued a comprehensive plan for the government of Canada. The timing of the Quebec Act might have been a coincidence, but its provisions infuriated Americans, and many Americans perceived the Quebec Act to be part of the Intolerable Acts. The Quebec Act granted the French in Canada the right to worship as Catholics, retain their language, and keep many of their legal practices, all marks of a tolerance that the Crown had refused to show its English colonists. The Quebec Act also expanded the borders of Canada into the Ohio Valley at the expense of the English-speaking colonies' claims to Western land. This dealt a harsh blow to Virginia planters who had hoped to profit from land speculation in the region. The king expected the severe punishment of Massachusetts to isolate that colony from its neighbors. But the Americans resisted this divide and conquer strategy. In every colony, newspaper essays and editorials urged readers to see Boston's troubles as their own. "This horrid attack upon the town of Boston," said the South Carolina Gazette, "we consider not as an attempt upon that town singly, but upon the whole continent." George Washington, by now an influential Virginia planter and militia officer, declared that the cause of Boston is now and ever will be the cause of America. Indeed, the Intolerable Acts produced a wave of sympathy for the beleaguered Bostonians, and relief efforts sprang up across the colonies. At this point, the Intolerable Acts are uniting the colonies in opposition against the British. In pamphlets and political essays, colonists placed the Intolerable Acts into the larger context of systematic oppression by the home country. Political writers referred to the British government as the enemy, conspiring to deprive Americans of their liberty, and urged colonists to defend themselves against the power and cunning of our adversaries. This unity of sentiment, however, was more fragile than it appeared. In the cities, bitter divisions quickly developed, and artisans struggled with merchants to control their mass meetings that would make strategy choices. Samuel Adams and the radical artisans and workers of Boston suggested what might be at stake in the struggle between elites and ordinary citizens when they formed a solemn league and covenant to lead a third intercolonial boycott of British goods. As most Bostonians knew, the words solemn league referred to a pact between the Scottish Presbyterians and English Puritans who had overthrown the royal government in the 1640s and beheaded a king. Adams and his allies had made their choice, armed rebellion. Yet even in crisis-torn Boston, not everyone wanted matters to go that far. And in the southern colonies, planters worried that slave revolts and class antagonisms or class divisions between the elite and poor farmers might be the ultimate outcome of escalating protest. Creating a national forum, the First Continental Congress. On September 5th, 1774, delegates from every colony but Georgia gathered in Philadelphia for a Continental Congress. Few of the delegates or the people they represented thought of themselves as revolutionaries. "We want no revolution," a North Carolina delegate bluntly stated. But in the eyes of their British rulers, he and other colonists were treading dangerously close to treason. After all, neither the king nor Parliament had authorized the Congress, which was intent on resisting acts of Parliament and defying the king. English men and women had been hanged as traitors for far less serious betrayals of the English government. Some of the most articulate political leaders in the colonies attended this First Continental Congress. Conservative delegates such as Joseph Galloway of Pennsylvania hoped to slow the pace of colonial resistance by substituting petitions to Parliament for the total boycott proposed by Samuel Adams. Their radical opponents, including Samuel Adams and his cousin John, Patrick Henry, and delegates from the artisan community of Philadelphia, demanded the boycott and more. Most of the delegates were desperately searching for a third choice, a way to express their grievances and demand that injustices be corrected without further eroding their relationship with England. The mounting crisis in Massachusetts diminished the chances of a moderate solution. Rumors spread that the Royal Navy was planning to bombard Boston and that General Gage was preparing to invade the countryside. Thousands of Massachusetts militiamen had begun mustering in Cambridge. The growing conflict drove many delegates into the radical camp. In this atmosphere of dread and anxiety, the Continental Congress approved the Continental Association, a boycott of all English goods to begin on December 1st, 1774. The Congress also passed strong resolutions demanding the repeal of the Intolerable Acts. This First Continental Congress had chosen radical tactics, but many delegates were torn between loyalty to Great Britain and loyalty to colony. Thomas Jefferson, a young Virginia planter and intellectual, tried to find a way out of this dilemma by separating loyalty to the king from resistance to Parliament. Jefferson argued that the colonists owed allegiance to the nation's king, not to Parliament, and that each colony did indeed have the right to legislate for itself. Not everyone agreed. If no compromise could be reached, the delegates and Americans everywhere would have to choose where their strongest loyalties lay. Joseph Galloway believed that he had worked out the necessary compromise. In his plan of union, Galloway called for a Grand Council elected by each colonial legislature that would share with Parliament the right to originate laws for the colonies. Congress rejected Galloway's compromise by the narrowest of margins. Then it was John Adams's turn to propose a solution. Under his skillful urging and direction, the Congress adopted the Declaration of Rights and Grievances, which politely but firmly established the colonial standard for acceptable legislation by Parliament. Colonists, said the Declaration, would consent to acts meant to regulate, quote, our external commerce, but they absolutely denied the legitimacy or lawfulness of an idea of taxation, internal or external, for raising revenue on the subjects of America without their consent. The delegates knew that the force behind the declaration came from the unspoken, but nevertheless real threat that rebellion would occur if the colonists' demands were not met. To make this threat clearer, Congress endorsed a set of resolutions rushed to Philadelphia from Suffolk County, Massachusetts. These Suffolk resolves called on the residents of that county to arm themselves and prepare to resist British military action. Congressional support for these resolves sent an unmistakable message that American leaders were willing to choose rebellion if politics failed. The delegates adjourned and headed home, bringing news of the Congress's decisions with them to their families and their communities. There was nothing to do now but wait for the Crown's response. When it came, it was electric. Blows must decide, declared King George III, whether they are to be subject to this country or independent. The decision for independence, considering the questions, what compromises were still available in 1775 to 76, and how might the Revolutionary War have been avoided? And what motivated some colonists to become loyalists and others to become patriots? Americans were anxious while they waited for the king and parliament to respond to the Declaration of Rights and Grievances, but they were not idle. In most colonies, a transfer of political power was occurring as the majority of Americans recognized the authority of anti-British patriot governments. Taking charge and enforcing policies. Imperial control broke down as communities in each colony refused to obey royal laws or acknowledge the authority of royal officers. For example, when General Thomas Gage, the acting governor of Massachusetts, refused to convene the Massachusetts Assembly, its members met anyway, taking up precautions for military resistance to Gage and his army. While the Redcoats occupied Boston, the rebellious assembly openly ordered the colonists to stockpile military supplies near the town of Concord. It matters today, the right to dissent. As the colonists moved toward declaring independence, men and women who remained loyal to the king were pressured to keep silent. Many, like Jonathan Sewall, who had publicly opposed independence, had to flee their home and country and find refuge in England or Canada. Others were forced to sign loyalty oaths to the newly independent governments. Throughout American history, men and women have opposed political and social choices made by the nation, including the entrance of the United States into World War I, women's suffrage, prohibition, and the wars in Vietnam and Iraq. The right to dissent, guaranteed by the Constitution, has been a critical part of the American political tradition since the nation began. Examining how dissent has been voiced and how it has been received is part of the story of all major controversial events. If you want, you can consider your position on dissent in times of national crisis. Do you believe the government has the right to suppress dissent during war or major disasters? Why or why not? And if you want, you can discuss the impact that modern technology has had on the ability of citizens to voice opposition and organize resistance to government policies, especially in an era of social media. The transition from royal to patriot political control was peaceful in communities where anti-British sentiment was strong. Where it was weak, or where the community was divided, radicals used persuasion, pressure, and open intimidation to advance the patriot cause. In most colonial cities and towns, patriot committees arose to enforce compliance with the boycott of British goods. These committees publicly exposed those who did not obey the Continental Association, publishing violators' names in local newspapers and calling on the community to shun them. These tactics were effective. Colonists suspected of sympathizing with the British were brought before committees and made to swear oaths of support for the patriot cause. When public shaming or political pressure did not work, most committees were ready to use threats of physical violence and to make good on them. In Connecticut, a group of patriots hauled a 70-year-old Anglican man from his bed, dragged him naked into the winter night, and beat him brutally because his loyalty to the Church of England made him suspect. In New England, many pro-British citizens or loyalists came to fear for their lives. In the wake of the Intolerable Acts, hundreds of them fled to the city of Boston, hoping General Gage could protect them from their neighbors. The shot heard round the world. King George continued to believe that resistance in most colonies would fade if the Massachusetts radicals were crushed. In January of 1775, he ordered General Gage to arrest the most notorious leaders of rebellion in that colony, Samuel Adams and John Hancock. Gage made plans to send redcoats to Concord with orders to seize the rapidly growing stockpile of weapons and arrest the two radical leaders along the way. The Patriots, of course, had their spies in Boston. Reports of the arrest orders and of suspicious troop preparations reached the militias gathered outside the occupied city. The only question was when and where Gage would attack. The Americans devised a warning system. As soon as Gage's troops began to move out of Boston, spies would signal the route with lanterns hung in the bell tower of the North Church. On April 18, 1775, riders waiting outside Boston saw two lanterns flash from the bell tower. Within moments, silversmith Paul Revere and his fellow messengers rode off to give news of the British Army's approach. Around sunrise on April 19, 1775, an advance guard of a few hundred redcoats reached the town of Lexington, where they expected to apprehend Adams and Hancock. In the pale light, they saw about 70 colonial militiamen waiting on the village green. As the badly outnumbered colonists began to disperse, eager and nervous redcoats broke ranks and rushed forward, sending up a triumphant cheer. No order came to fire, but in the confusion, shots rang out. 8 Americans were killed, most of them shot in the back as they ran for safety. 9 more were wounded. Later, Americans who told the story of the skirmish at Lexington would insist that the first musket fired there sounded like a shot heard around the world. The British troops marched from Lexington to Concord. Surprised to find the town nearly deserted, they began a methodical search for weapons. All they uncovered were 500 musket balls, which they dumped into a nearby pond. They then burned the town's Liberty Tree. Ignoring this act of provocation, the Concord Minutemen, in hiding nearby, waited patiently. When the moment seemed right, they swooped down on the unsuspecting British troops guarding the town's north bridge. The sudden attack by the Americans shocked the redcoats, who fled in a panic back toward Boston. The Minutemen followed, gathering more men along the path of pursuit. Together, these American farmers, artisans, servants, and shopkeepers terrorized the young British soldiers, firing on them from behind barns, stone walls, and trees. 73 redcoats were killed, 174 were wounded, and 26 were missing. The day after the battles of Lexington and Concord, thousands of New England militiamen poured in from the surrounding countryside, dug trenches, and laid siege to Boston. As far as they and thousands of other Americans were concerned, including the Loyalist refugees crowded into the city, war had begun. The Second Continental Congress. When the Continental Congress reconvened in May 1775, it began at once to ready the colonies for war. This Second Continental Congress authorized the printing of American paper money for the purchase of supplies and appointed a committee to oversee foreign relations. It approved the creation of a Continental Army and chose George Washington, the Virginia veteran of the French and Indian War, to serve as its commander. The Congress was clearly ready to defend Americans' rights and to protect their liberties. But some delegates still hoped to find a peaceful solution to the crisis, despite the bloodshed at Lexington and Concord. This sentiment led the Congress to draft the Olive Branch Petition, which offered the king a choice. The colonists would end their armed resistance if the king would withdraw the British military and revoke the Intolerable Acts. Many delegates must have doubted the king's willingness to make such a concession. For the very next day, Congress issued a public statement in defense of the war preparations. This declaration of the causes and necessity of taking up arms boldly accused the British government of tyranny. It stopped short, however, of declaring colonial independence. Across the Atlantic, British leaders struggled to find some negotiating points despite the king's refusal to bend. Almost 2 months before the battles at Lexington and Concord, Lord North had drafted a set of conciliatory propositions for Parliament and the American Continental Congress to consider. North's proposals gave no ground on Parliament's right to tax the colonies, but they did offer to suspend taxation if Americans would raise funds for their own military defense. Members of Parliament who were sympathetic toward the Americans also pressed for compromise. They insisted that it made better sense to keep the colonies as a market for English goods than to lose them in a battle over raising revenue. Cooler heads, however, did not prevail. Americans rejected Lord North's proposals in July of 1775. The king, loath to compromise, rejected the olive branch petition. George III then persuaded Parliament to pass an American Prohibitory Act, instructing the Royal Navy to seize American ships engaged in any form of trade, as if the same ships were of open enemies. For all intents and purposes, King George III declared war on his colonies before the colonies declared war on their king. The impact of common sense. War was a fact, yet few American voices were calling for a complete political and emotional break with Britain. Even the most ardent patriots continued to justify their actions as upholding the British Constitution. They were rebelling, they said, to preserve the rights guaranteed to English citizens, not to establish an independent nation. Their drastic actions were necessary because a corrupt parliament and corrupt ministers were trampling on those rights. If any American political leaders believed the king was as corrupt as his advisors in his parliament, they did not make this view public. Then, in January 1776, Thomas Paine, an Englishman who had come to America a few years earlier, published a pamphlet he called Common Sense. Paine's pamphlet broke the silence about King George III. Tom Paine was a corset maker by trade, but a political radical by temperament. He directed common sense at ordinary citizens, not their political leaders. Like the preachers of the First Great Awakening, Paine rejected the formal language of the elite, adopting instead a plain, urgent, and emotional vocabulary and writing style designed to reach a mass audience. Common Sense was unique in its content as well as its style. Paine made no excuses for his revolutionary zeal. He expressed no admiration for the British Constitution or reverence for the British political system. Instead, he attacked the sanctity of the monarchy head-on. He challenged the idea of a hereditary ruler, questioned the value of a monarchy as an institution, and he criticized the personal character of the men who ruled as kings. Paine put it bluntly and sarcastically, "Of more worth is one honest man to society, and in the sight of God, than all the crowned ruffians that ever lived." He dismissed George III as nothing more than a royal brute, and he urged Americans to establish their own republic. A republic, by the way, is a nation in which supreme power resides in the citizens who elect representatives to govern them. Common Sense sold 120,000 copies in its first 3 months in print. The impact of Paine's words resounded in the taverns and coffee houses where ordinary farmers, artisans, shopkeepers, and laborers took up his call for independence and the creation of a republic. Political leaders acknowledged Paine's importance, although some begrudged the popular admiration lavished on this poorly educated artisan, whose flamboyant writing style they found unsuitable. Declaring independence. The Second Continental Congress, lagging far behind popular sentiment, inched its way toward a formal declaration of independence. John Adams fumed at its snail's pace. But finally, on June 7, 1776, Adams's close ally, Virginia lawmaker Richard Henry Lee, rose on the floor of Congress and offered this straightforward motion: that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is, and ought to be, totally dissolved. Lee's resolution was no more than a statement of reality, yet the Congress chose to postpone its final vote until July. The delay would give members time to win over the few faint-hearted delegates from the middle colonies. It would also allow the committee appointed to draft a formal Declaration of Independence time to complete its work. To draft the Declaration, Congress chose John Adams, Connecticut's Roger Sherman, Benjamin Franklin, and New York landowner Robert Livingston. But these men delegated the task of writing the document to the fifth and youngest member of the committee, Thomas Jefferson. The 33-year-old Virginian was not a social radical like Samuel Adams and Tom Paine. He was not an experienced politician like John Adams and Benjamin Franklin, and he lacked the reputation of fellow Virginians George Washington and Richard Henry Lee. But the committee members recognized that Jefferson could draw on a deep and broad knowledge of political theory and philosophy. He had read the works of Enlightenment philosophers, classical theorists, and 17th century English revolutionaries. And though shy and somewhat halting in his speech, Thomas Jefferson was a master of written prose. Jefferson began the Declaration of Independence with a defense of revolution based on self-evident truths about humanity's inalienable rights, rights that included life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. In a later draft, the rights became unalienable and property became happiness. Jefferson argued that these rights were natural rather than historical. In other words, they came from the Creator rather than developing out of human law, government, or tradition. Thus, they were broader and more sacred than the specific rights of Englishmen. With this philosophical groundwork in place, Jefferson moved on to list the grievances that demanded America end its relationship with Britain. He focused on the king's abuse of power rather than on the oppressive legislation passed by Parliament. All government rested on the consent of the governed, Jefferson asserted, and the people had the right to overthrow any government that tyrannized rather than protected them, that threatened rather than respected their unalienable rights. The genius of Jefferson's declaration was not that it contained novel or new ideas, but that it contained ideas that were commonly accepted by most colonists. Jefferson gave voice to these beliefs, clearly and firmly. He also gave voice to the sense of abuse and injustice that had been growing in colonial society for several decades. Declaring loyalties. Delegates to the Second Continental Congress approved the Declaration of Independence on July 2, 1776, and made their approval public on July 4th. As John Adams was fond of saying, the die had been cast, and Americans had to weigh loyalty to the king against loyalty to a new nation. In the face of such a critical choice, many wavered. Throughout the war that followed the Declaration, a surprising number of colonists clung to neutrality, hoping that the breach could be resolved without their having to participate or choose sides. Those who did commit themselves based their decisions on deeply held beliefs and personal considerations as well as fears. For some of the perhaps 150,000 active loyalists, their commitment was a matter of personal character. Reluctance to break a solemn oath of allegiance to the king, or fear of the chaos and violence that were a real part of revolution, could motivate a colonist to remain loyal rather than to rebel. Many loyalists believed that tradition and common sense argued for acknowledging parliamentary supremacy and the king's right to rule. These colonists had an abiding respect for the structure of the British government. In addition, in their judgment, the advantages of remaining within the protective circle of Europe's most powerful nation seemed too obvious to debate, and the likelihood of swift and bloody defeat at the hands of the British Army and Navy was too obvious to risk. Many of the men who articulated the loyalist position were members of the colonial elite. They frankly admitted their fears that a revolution would unleash the madness of the multitude. The tyranny of the mob, they argued, was far more damaging than the tyranny of which the king stood accused. For many colonists who chose loyalism, however, the deciding issues were economic. Holders of royal offices and merchants who depended on trade with British manufacturers found loyalty the compelling option. The loyalist ranks were also filled with colonists from the multitude. Many small farmers in the Carolinas and tenant farmers in New York gave their support to the crown when their political and economic foes, the great planters or the wealthy manor lords, became patriots. The choice of which side to back often hinged, therefore, on local struggles and economic conflicts, rather than beliefs about government and imperial or philosophical issues. For African Americans, the rallying call of liberty was familiar long before the revolution began. Decades of slave resistance and rebellion demonstrated that Black colonists needed little reminder of the value of freedom. Instead, many slaves viewed the revolution as they viewed epidemics and imperial warfare, as a potential opportunity to gain their own liberty. In the same way, many free Blacks saw the Revolution as a possible opportunity to win civil rights they had been denied before 1776. African Americans had pointed out the inconsistencies of the radical position even before the Declaration of Independence. In 1773, a group of enslaved Blacks in Boston petitioned the governor and the assembly for their freedom, in behalf of all those who are held in a state of slavery within the bowels of a free country. Some white colonists appreciated these sentiments. In 1774, while John Adams debated the threat of political slavery for colonial Englishmen in the First Continental Congress, his wife Abigail observed, "It always appeared a most iniquitous or sinful scheme to me to fight ourselves for what we are daily robbing and plundering from those who have as good a right to freedom as we have." As a note, John Adams was not a slave owner. Tom Paine agreed. Writing as humanist in a Philadelphia newspaper, Paine urged white patriots to abolish slavery and to give freed Blacks Western land grants. Other patriots worried that slaves would seek their freedom by supporting the British in the war. Indeed, in 1775, the royal governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, expressed his intention to, quote, "arm all my own Negroes and receive all others that will come to me whom I shall declare free." Rumors of this plan horrified neighboring Maryland planters who demanded that their governor issue arms and ammunition to protect against a slave insurrection or uprising. Throughout the South, white communities braced themselves for a Black struggle for freedom that would emerge in the middle of the colonial struggle for independence. When Dunmore did offer freedom to all indentured servants, Negroes or others, able and willing to bear arms who escaped their masters, he was more interested in disrupting the slave-based plantation economy of his American enemies than in African American rights. But slaves responded, crossing into British lines in great enough numbers to create an Ethiopian regiment of soldiers. These Black loyalists wore a banner across their uniforms that read "Liberty to Slaves." In the Southern campaigns of the long war that followed, thousands of Black men, women, and children made their way to the British lines. Once in uniform, Black soldiers were usually assigned to work in road construction and other manual labor rather than to participate in combat. Perhaps as many as 50,000 slaves gained their freedom during the war as a result of either British policy or the disruptions that made escape possible. Indians' responses to news of the war were far from uniform. At first, many considered the revolution a family quarrel that should be avoided. The revolutionaries would have been satisfied to see the Indians adopt this policy of neutrality. They knew they were unlikely to win Indian support given the legacy of border warfare and the actions of land-hungry American settlers. As early as 1775, the Second Continental Congress issued a proclamation warning Indians to remain neutral. But the British, recognizing their advantage, made strong efforts to win Indian support. Indian leaders proceeded cautiously, however. When a British negotiator boasted to Flying Crow that a British victory was inevitable, the Seneca chief was unimpressed. "If you are so strong, brother, and they but as a weak boy, why ask our assistance? You say they are all mad, foolish, wicked, and deceitful. I say you are so, and they are wise, for you want us to destroy ourselves in your war, and they advise us to live in peace." The British continued to press for Indian participation in the war, and many Indian tribes and confederations eventually decided that the Crown would better serve their interests and respect their rights than the colonists would. First, the British were much more likely than the colonists to be able to provide a steady supply of the manufactured goods and weapons that Indians relied on in the 18th century. Second, colonial territorial ambitions threatened the Indians along the southern and northwestern frontiers. Third, an alliance with the British offered some possibility of recouping lands and trading benefits that were lost in the past. No uniformity emerged, however. Intertribal rivalries and Indians' concerns about the safety of their own villages often determined alignments. Even among the Iroquois, pro-British Senecas burned the crops and houses of Oneidas who had joined forces with the Patriots. In the southern backcountry, fierce fighting between Indians and revolutionaries seemed a continuation of the century's many border wars. But there too, alignments could shift. Although the Cherokees began the war as British allies, a split developed, producing an internal civil war within the Cherokee Nation. Fewer than half of the colonists threw in their lot immediately with the revolutionaries. Among those who did were people whose economic interests made independence seem worth the risk, including artisans and urban laborers, as well as merchants who traded outside the British Empire, most large and some small farmers, and many members of the Southern planter elite. For these Americans, it was not simply a matter of escaping unfair taxation. A release from Britain's mercantile policies, which restricted colonial trade with other nations, held out the promise of expanded trade and an end to the risks of smuggling. Sometimes the pressure for independence came from below rather than from a colony's political leadership, most notably in Virginia, where many elite planters were pressed by more radical, ordinary farmers to support independence or lose their positions of authority. In addition, colonists affected by the Great Awakening's message of egalitarianism often chose the patriot side. Americans with a conscious, articulated radical vision of society, the Tom Paines and Samuel Adamses, supported the revolution and its promise of a republic. Many who became revolutionaries shared the hope for a better life under a government that encouraged its citizens to be virtuous and to live in simplicity. As Americans of English, European, Indian, and African heritage armed themselves or fled from the violence and bloodshed that they saw coming, they realized that the conflict had two faces. This was a war for independence, but it was also a civil war. In the South, it pitted slave against master, Cherokee against Cherokee, and frontier farmer against coastal planter. In New England, it set neighbor against neighbor, forcing scores of loyalist families to flee. In some instances, children were set against parents, and wives refused to support the cause their husbands had chosen. Whatever the outcome of the struggle ahead, Americans knew that it would come at great cost. I'm going to read the summary and then go back to the individual voices section. Summary. The British victory in the Great War for Empire produced many new problems. The British had to govern the French population in Canada and maintain security against Indians on a greatly expanded colonial frontier. They had to pay an enormous war debt but continue to finance strong and well-armed forces to keep the empire they had won. To deal with these new circumstances, the English government chose to impose revenue-raising measures on the colonies, meaning they chose to tax them. The Sugar Act of 1764 had tightened customs collections. The Stamp Act of 1765 had placed a direct tax on legal documents, and the Townshend Acts of 1767 set import taxes on English products such as paint and tea. Colonists had protested each of these sharp shifts in policy, for they saw Parliament's revenue-raising actions as an abuse of power. Political debate in the colonies began to focus on the possibility that the British government meant to curtail or to cut short American liberties. Crowds directed by the Sons of Liberty attacked royal officials, and in Boston, 5 civilians died in a clash with British troops known as the Boston Massacre. But colony-wide boycotts of British goods proved to be the most effective form of protest. They led to the repeal of all 3 taxes, the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and the Townshend Acts. Most of the Townshend Acts, that is. Political activists prepared for a quick and united response to any new crises by creating organizations like the Committees of Correspondence. In 1773, the British expected little American opposition to the Tea Act, but they were wrong. In Boston, a group of activists dumped thousands of pounds worth of tea into the harbor, enraging British officials, who as punishment closed the port of Boston to all trade. This and the other intolerable or coercive acts infuriated colonists, and they took united action in support of Massachusetts. A new colonial forum, the First Continental Congress, met in 1774 to debate the colony's relationship to England and to issue a united protest, sending the king a declaration of rights and grievances. But George III had rejected the colonists' appeal for compromise, instead declaring that, quote, blows must decide. After British troops fought militiamen at Lexington and Concord, the Second Continental Congress prepared for war. Tom Paine's pamphlet Common Sense pushed many reluctant colonists into the revolutionary camp. In July of 1776, Congress issued the Declaration of Independence, drafted by Thomas Jefferson, which defended the colonists' right to resist a tyrannical king. In 1776, Americans faced the difficult task of choosing sides, loyalty to the crown or revolution. African Americans and Indians had to decide whether to support one side or the other, or to try to remain neutral in the middle of revolution. For thousands, the outcome of this crisis of loyalty was exile from home and family. For others, it meant death or injury on the battlefield, widowhood, or life as an orphan. In 1776, however, its outcome was unclear. Going back to individual voices, James Otis Jr. argues against the writs of assistance. In 1761, the British government decided to reissue writs of assistance that would allow customs officials to search any premises for contraband without stating the exact nature of the materials they were seeking. James Otis Jr. served as the lawyer for the Massachusetts merchants opposing this policy. Some colonists believed this was the first salvo in the War for Independence, meaning the first shot. In his courtroom presentation, Otis condemned the writs as he explains in this excerpt. While I read this, you can consider these questions. First, the fear of tyranny became a common theme in the protest against British policies in the years before the American Revolution. Would you say the policies of the king and parliament rose to the level of tyranny? Second, Jews and Christians believed that the archangel Gabriel would blow a trumpet to signal Judgment Day, and that appears to simply be a note, not a question. If you were a lawyer defending the use of these writs, what arguments would you make to justify their use in colonial Massachusetts? It appears to me the worst instrument of arbitrary power, the most destructive of English liberty and the fundamental principles of law that ever was found in an English law book. Every one with this writ may be a tyrant. Every man may reign secure in his petty tyranny and spread terror and desolation around him until the trump of the archangel shall excite different emotions in his soul. A person with this writ in the daytime may enter all houses, shops, etc. at will and command all to assist him. Even their menial servants are allowed to lord it over us. Now, one of the most essential branches of English liberty is the freedom of one's house. A man's house is his castle, and whilst he is quiet, he is as well guarded as a prince in his castle. This writ, if it should be declared legal, would totally annihilate this privilege. Custom house officers may enter our houses when they please. We are commanded to permit their entry. Their menial servants may enter, may break locks, bars, and everything in their way, and whether they break through malice or revenge, no man, no court can inquire. Bare suspicion without oath is sufficient. Finally, a deeper understanding of history on page 121. It's complicated. Wander through your school library or your local bookstore. You might see a dozen books on the American Revolution by a dozen different historians. In fact, you might see many more. Ever wonder why? It's not that historians can't agree on most of the facts, that is, on what happened. The problem or the challenge is that we also want to explain why it happened. And with an event as dramatic as a revolution, and even with the most ordinary events, like a basketball team won a championship or why the whole class failed a biology exam, we know the answer won't be simple. In fact, if historians had a motto, it would surely be, it's complicated. With most events, we start by asking, what were the immediate causes? In the case of the Revolution, we could look at the growing tension between England and the colonies after the French and Indian War. We could cite the end of salutary neglect, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the boycotts, the congresses, the political essays, the violence in Boston, the coercive acts, and the shot heard around the world. This succession of events and actions might be thought of as the tinder for the blaze of revolution. But we also realize that there were long-term causes that shaped the American and British response to events in the 1760s and 1770s. Some were structural: the emergence of colonial assemblies, their rising power, and the vested interest political leaders had in retaining that power. Some were economic: the growth of the nation that British regulation no longer protected, but instead hindered economic growth and prosperity in the colonies. Some were ideological: the very different definitions of representation held by colonists and Parliament that led to misunderstandings and mistrust. Or the conflicting interpretations of the new legislation, which colonists labeled as a sign of tyranny and political decadence, while the British government saw it as a necessary policy change. Every historian tries to weigh these and other causes carefully, but we often disagree about how much weight to give each of them in explaining why the American Revolution occurred. If you were asked to explain the revolution, what would you point to as its major cause? Was a clash of economic interests the driving force behind revolution? Were ideas and ideals the most powerful factor in the move for independence? Did self-interest motivate leaders more than principles? Did the personalities and character of leading figures shape events? Not sure? Now you understand why your library shelf is filled with books about the American Revolution, because, to say it again, it's complicated.